This is video 2 in a small series on some work we're doing on a Kingsong 14S. As you can see, we have already got the wheel dismantled, ready to move on in this particular episode with changing the tyre. If you didn't see how we got this far, please go back and look at video 1 in this playlist. So in this video, we will be removing the motor, and that will allow us to change the tyre. This is done by removing the 5 larger screws that's found on each side of the wheel, and that allows us to drop the motor out. Because of the motor cables, we can actually only pull the motor out so far without disconnecting them. So we're going to disconnect that first, which will allow the complete removal of the motor. If you trace the wires from the wheel axle back up to the connectors, there are 2 of them on the Kingsong 14s. The larger one is providing basically the power to the motor, and the smaller one above that is the Hall effect sensor connector. The Hall effect sensors are what keeps the wheel balancing correctly when you're riding it. The power connector may have a cable tie around it. That will need to be removed. And the Hall effect sensor connector, Kingsong usually gunk it up. These are both there to prevent any accidental disconnection of the cabling, which will cause a rather sudden and unfortunate stop. I don't actually re-gunk the Hall effect sensor when I'm reconnecting it. I use duct tape, but it's the same effect that we basically want to stop the connector from accidentally coming apart.
Each of the inner covers has 5 large screws which attach it to the pedal hanger, which is attached to the axle with the motor of course inside that. So we can remove these now, and that lets us release the motor and allow us to drop it out.
Removing the motor will be a lot easier with a bit of help. While it would normally just slide straight out, because of the motor wires protruding from the end of the axle, we need to be careful to not catch those with the shell as we slide it off. Damaging that motor wire is not ideal. If possible, while the case is flexed outward, what I try to do is slide a small piece of duct tape between the case and the pedal hanger, and that basically sits upward and over the motor cable, and having that in place will help the case slide upwards as you remove it from the motor itself. Try pushing the wheel out as straight as possible so it doesn't wedge in place between the 2 shells. And of course, being careful not to catch that leading edge of the case on the motor cables. Once you're past that key point, that leading edge is gone, the case should smoothly slide off. Connect this through the slot, and we can put the case to one side. Now let's clean up this wheel and get ready to change the tyre. Having a work surface with a slot or a hole in it is ideal, as this lets you drop the motor cables through it and work from the other side of the wheel. And this means you're much less likely to cause any accidental damage to those wires. So we're going to remove the valve cap, and then using a valve removal tool, unscrew the valve itself, and that will allow the tyre to fully deflate. All air from the tube can flow out freely. Next, we're going to need some tyre irons, or sometimes called tyre spoons. Starting opposite the valve stem itself, we're going to gently lever the edge of the tyre over the rim, being really careful not to go too deep and pinch the tube inside the tyre. We don't want to damage that in any way, otherwise we definitely need to replace it. Of course, if it is flat, you have a lot less to worry about. Removing the tyre itself using 3 irons is ideal, as this allows you to maintain the length that you've already brought over the rim of the wheel, and have a third one ready to extend that area, that length. You'll then reach a point that you can actually just use your hands to completely remove the first side of the tyre. Once this is done, carefully push the valve stem back through the rim, and you can then remove the tube from inside the tyre. Then it's just a simple matter of removing the tyre itself from the rim. With this done, you can clean up the rim from all dirt and residue. We want to check it for any rough areas, anything on the inside that may damage that inner tube. Now the tyre that we've removed today still has a fair bit of life left in it, but we're changing it for one with a different tread pattern, and that's going to make it a bit interesting. It's going to give it a slightly different ride characteristic. This new tyre is non-directional, so it doesn't matter which way you put it on. But if your tyre does specify a direction, you want to put it on the correct way. Remember that the motor wires extend from the left side of the motor, and that helps you work out when it's not on the wheel which way the tyre should be placed. This tyre also doesn't have any markings to indicate a lighter side or a lightest point, so we can just put it on. If your tyre does specify a lightest point, then you want to position that as close as possible to the valve, which is the heaviest side of the wheel, and that should possibly balance things out a little bit better. Once the first side of the tyre is back on the rim, we can refit the tube. Starting with the valve stem and pushing that through the hole in the rim, and then ensuring the whole tube sits comfortably or relaxed around the rim and inside the tyre. Take your time to get the valve stem placed correctly, as this will make it a lot easier later on when you're adding air to your tyre. It's worth noting that the bend in the valve stem is always slightly towards one side, so putting it on the wrong way will make it very difficult to pull the valve away from the rim to get access to it for putting more air in. So if it's too tight, possibly worth trying the other way around. Once everything is looking good, let's add a bit of air to the tube to expand it into place. Luckily, I have an air compressor in my balcony workshop, so it's quite easy for me. Though it can be a little tricky to hold the valve in place when the tube is completely empty. In this case, using a valve extender can be a really handy thing, as it provides something to hold onto without twisting on the valve stem itself. Don't put too much air in the tube, just enough to hold a loose shape. Then we're ready to fit the second side of the tyre over the rim. Once again, start opposite to the valve stem, as this allows the tyre to move down into the smallest diameter, the centre of the rim, and that'll help make it a lot easier to refit it as you get to the far side. Once you can't go any further, use your tyre irons to hold it in place and hook the last of it into place inside the rim. Of course, all the way through, really careful not to damage that tube or the valve stem while you're putting the tyre back in place. While the tube is still mostly empty now, triple check that the positioning of it is correct and slide the tyre around the rim as necessary to, I suppose, shimmy the tube into that perfect position so the valve stem is sitting nice and relaxed on the right angle through the rim. Now we'll pump the tyre back up and check that everything's looking good and that it holds air. At this time I've pumped up the tyre to 30 psi. Less than will be used for riding, but it's enough for me to check that the valve position is good and that the tyre is seated evenly. To check the tyre is seated evenly, I'm fastening the pedal hanger so that the wheel is just above the bench. That allows it to spin freely. I'm picking a reference point off the bench itself, and I'm watching the position of the outermost point of the tyre as I spin it. If I can see the tyre moving in and out from that point, then it needs to be adjusted slightly. Today though, we are also going to add slime to the tube. So let's do that first, as it has to be done without the valve in, and we can check the tyre position afterward. Sliming has been done by a number of people before, so I won't dwell too much on this. Basically it's done by removing the valve and squirting in about 4 ounces of slime into the tube. This is a lot easier said than done, as it is, after all, slime. So squirt some in, check the level in the bottle that's left, squirt in some more and carry on until the appropriate amount is in the tube. And it's worth noting that there are 2 types of slime, slime for tubes and slime for tubeless tyres. Do make sure you get the right one. After cleaning up, putting the valve back in, we can inflate the tyre once again. If this wheel was then going straight back into an EUC, I would turn it on and spin it up, lifting the wheel, to distribute the slime right around the outside of the tube. But we're not putting this back together right now, we have some more work to do, so we'll have to remember to do that later on. Once again, without having too much air in the tube, the tyre's holding its position and we can still break the bead to adjust it, adjust the seating of it if necessary. So using a reference point that we've got, it can be any point that you can see in relation to the edge of the tyre, something that doesn't move. Spinning the wheel lets us identify any bulges or depressions, and once we know the high or low points, we can encourage the tyre into the correct position. Once it's running fairly true, we can then inflate it fully, check it and consider it done. This one is now at 40 psi and looking pretty good, so it's time to put the wheel or the motor back into the EUC chassis. But before we do that, we're going to add a very small enhancement. Remember how the motor cable exits the axle sideways? Well, we're going to add some duct tape, as we did when we took this off, across the bottom of those wires to soften the encounter that they have with the inner case. The point here is to remove that leading edge that hits the wires and potentially damages them. So we're almost adding a duct tape ramp to help the cover slide over the wires when we want to remove it in the future without causing any damage. I've started doing this on all Kingsong wheels when I happen to have the motor out of the shell. It doesn't affect the handling at all or anything to do, but it does allow the motor to slide out of the case with less chance of damaging cables for the motor. It doesn't have to be a big piece, it's just enough to shield the cable where it exits the axle and bends to the side. For reassembly, it is critical that the motor is facing the correct way. So double check which side of the case the motor wires need to be on, obviously to connect to the wires from the control board. These obviously go on the same side, and then you've got everything facing the right way. And with some assistance from the lovely Chrissy, we now have the cables through and the inner cases back in place. We can now reposition the wires with the correct angle, and the duct tape is still in place for the next time we need to remove the motor. Now it's just a matter of reassembly, starting with the 5 screws on each side to attach the inner covers to the pedal hangers. We don't want to lift the wheel by the cover while we're doing this, as it's not secured in place, remember. What we want to do is have the covers in a nice relaxed position while we lock everything in place. Now we can reconnect the motor and the Hall effect sensors and check that we have everything working correctly and that the wheel is balancing. We're also just going to spin it up while we're here to help distribute that slime around the entire circumference of the tube. Everything's looking good here, so now we can fully tighten those mounting bolts, and we can also secure the motor connectors so that they don't come loose at all. The remainder of the reassembly, putting on the outer covers, pedals, etc., is the reverse of the disassembly. I haven't videoed that here, as in our case we're actually going to go on and replace the control board, but obviously you can refer back to video 1 if you want to see those steps for the disassembly and reassembly. If you want to see how to replace the control board, keep looking. The next video on this playlist will be doing exactly that.